Speaker Johnson extracted a lone folder from beneath his wooden gavel, resting it on the dais with the delicate caution of someone handling an explosive device. He then delivered a 7-word sentence that made Ilhan Omar momentarily forget how to draw breath. "Representative, I have your sister's address." Instantly, all color vanished from Omar's face, broadcast live across every network camera. Merely 15 minutes earlier, she had branded this very man a Christian nationalist and deemed him the most ill-equipped speaker in American history. She had scoffed at his vacant financial disclosures and proclaimed that his leadership role was simply a fluke born of Republican dysfunction. Yet she neglected one vital detail. Mike Johnson had dedicated 20 years to practicing as a constitutional litigator long before he ever grasped that gavel. He did not simply debate for a living, he prosecuted cases, and today the defendant was occupying the witness chair. Observers were about to witness a constitutional lawyer armed with the Speaker's power systematically dismantle a sitting Congresswoman utilizing nothing but public records, federal documentation, and the United States Constitution. There was no yelling and no dramatic flair. He was simply a soft-spoken man from Shreveport who also happens to be the highest-ranking government official ever to emerge from Louisiana, methodically constructing a case that Ilhan Omar would be unable to withstand. The House Oversight Committee convened its hearing at 9:30 a.m. inside the Rayburn House Office Building. Its official designation was Federal Program Integrity and Congressional Financial Transparency. Yet everyone within Washington understood the true focus: Minnesota's pervasive fraud crisis. The expanding federal probes into the Feeding Our Future scandal, alongside billions in misappropriated taxpayer funds, had escalated to a point where the most visible elected official from the state's most severely impacted district could no longer dodge questioning. Representative Ilhan Omar had been issued a subpoena to appear not as a member of the committee, but strictly as a witness. Speaker Mike Johnson's attendance at this hearing was highly irregular, as speakers seldom join oversight panels. However, Johnson had declared his involvement 3 days prior via a succinct statement that ignited intense speculation across Washington. As Speaker of the House and a constitutional attorney, I will participate in Wednesday's hearing to ensure that Article I oversight authority is exercised with the thoroughness this matter demands. Political journalists immediately interpreted the subtext. Johnson was not going there to watch, he was going there to interrogate. Omar arrived accompanied by legal counsel, 2 legislative assistants, and a pre-written statement. She was dressed in a navy blazer worn over her hijab, her face set in the mask of calculated defiance that had become her signature throughout her 7 years in Congress. She had successfully navigated the Trump administration, her ousting from the Foreign Affairs Committee, and various censure efforts. She survived because she comprehended a fundamental Washington truth that eluded most of her detractors. Whoever dictates the narrative framework ultimately dictates the result. Her framework remained constant. Every critique is rooted in racism. Every investigation constitutes targeted persecution. Every inquiry is a manifestation of Islamophobia. Johnson was seated 3 chairs away from the center of the dais with only a slender manila folder positioned before him. There were no massive binders akin to Kennedy's famous visual aids, nor were there stacks of classified documents. He had only that single folder equipped with colored tabs, a yellow legal pad, a writing instrument, and a pocket-sized copy of the Constitution, the exact same edition he had carried in his suit pocket throughout his 20-year legal career. Chairman James Comer initiated the session and introduced the witnesses. Omar proceeded to read her prepared remarks, delivering 12 minutes of measured indignation regarding the weaponization of congressional oversight against immigrant populations and the unconstitutional profiling of Muslim Americans. She referenced her background as a refugee, her family's immigration from Somalia, and her sworn duty to represent Minnesota's 5th District. Her delivery was refined, well-rehearsed, and compelling. Following her statement, Comer yielded the floor to the Speaker. Johnson repositioned his microphone and spoke in his customary manner, balanced and moderate, lacking both the sweet drawl of Kennedy or the biting Appalachian tone of Vance. His tone was that of a courtroom attorney, engineered for final arguments rather than casual storytelling. Representative Omar, thank you for being here. I know this isn't comfortable. I want you to know that I intend to be fair, thorough, and respectful. I'm going to ask you questions based on documents, public documents, your own filings. I'm not going to ambush you, he stated, pausing briefly. I'm going to give you every opportunity to explain. Omar narrowed her eyes, instantly recognizing the rhythm of his speech. Having spent considerable time around legal professionals, she understood that when a lawyer pledges fairness, an utterly devastating cross-examination is imminent. Nevertheless, she had formulated her own strategy. Speaker Johnson, Omar interjected, leaning toward her microphone before he could pose his initial inquiry. Before you begin, I want the American people to understand who is questioning me today. Johnson ceased writing on his legal pad and raised his eyes. You are the Speaker of the House with no assets. Your financial disclosure reports nothing above $1,000. You are, by your own filings, the poorest speaker in modern American history, she declared, allowing the statement to linger. You work for the Alliance Defending Freedom, an organization the Southern Poverty Law Center has designated as a hate group. You spent your career fighting against the civil rights of LGBTQ Americans. You were the architect of efforts to overturn the 2020 election. She sat up straighter. You are a Christian nationalist, Mr. Speaker, and this hearing is your inquisition. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the Democratic side of the dais, while a progressive journalist in the viewing gallery typed rapidly. Omar's aides exchanged pleased looks. The interaction was unfolding exactly as they had practiced. Johnson displayed no outward reaction. He jotted a note on his legal pad and waited a full 5 seconds after her remarks concluded before responding. Representative, you just brought up my financial disclosure. I appreciate that. Let's start there because I think it's actually the perfect place to begin, he said, flipping to the first tab in his folder. You're correct. My financial disclosure shows no assets above $1,000. I'm the son of a Shreveport firefighter. My father, James Michael Johnson Sr., was critically burned in 1984 when a warehouse exploded. His partner died. My father survived, but he was permanently disabled. He never worked again. Johnson's voice remained steady, yet it carried a profound depth, a distinct solemnity of a man reciting a familiar tragedy to which he has never truly grown accustomed. My mother raised 4 children on a firefighter's disability pension. I put myself through LSU, undergraduate, and law school. I worked as a constitutional litigator for 20 years. I earned a lawyer's salary. My wife, Kelly, was a school teacher, then a pastoral counselor. We have 4 children. We live in Benton, Louisiana, a town of 2,000 people. He locked eyes with Omar. You called me the poorest speaker in history. That's accurate. I don't own stocks. I don't own investment properties. I don't have a consulting firm. I don't have a winery. He paused deliberately. I don't have a venture capital company that went from $42 to $25 million in 12 months. A palpable shift occurred in the hearing room. Since you brought up financial transparency, Representative, let's compare, Johnson said. He boldly inscribed 2 sets of figures onto his legal pad, writing them large enough for the broadcast cameras to capture clearly. Financial comparison table. Figure Johnson, assets $0, time frame, notes 20 years. Figure Omar, assets $700 to $30 million, time frame, notes sales over 12 months. My household wealth has stayed roughly the same for 2 decades. Yours underwent what I can only describe as a financial miracle, he observed, placing his pen down. In constitutional law, we have a term for things that require explanation. We call them questions of material fact. Your finances, Representative, are a very large question of material fact. Omar's jaw clenched. My husband's business valuations reflect standard. I'll get to your husband's businesses, Johnson smoothly interjected, his demeanor unyielding. But I want to be precise about the timeline first, because precision matters in legal proceedings. And make no mistake, Representative Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution gives this body the authority to discipline its own members. This is a legal proceeding. He shifted to the second tab in his folder. Let's talk about the E Street Group. Johnson presented a printed FEC filing summary that was tabbed and highlighted in yellow, not for theatrical effect, but for absolute accuracy. The E Street Group was a political consulting firm owned by Tim Minette. Mr. Minette is now your husband. But when your campaign began paying his company, he was married to another woman, Beth Minette. Johnson read directly from the official document. Between 2018 and 2020, your campaign paid the E Street Group approximately $2.9 million. That was 78% of E Street's total revenue. He glanced up 78%. Nearly 4 out of every $5 Mr. Minette's company earned came from you. Omar's legal counsel muttered something to her, prompting Omar to give a subtle shake of her head. In April 2019, Beth Minette filed for divorce. In her filing, which is a public court document, she stated that her husband told her he was, and I'm quoting, romantically involved with and in love with another woman, Ilhan Omar. Johnson placed the paperwork down with the meticulous care of a lawyer presenting critical evidence to a jury. Now, here's what the FEC filings show happened next. Before the affair became public, your campaign was already paying Mr. Minette's firm significant sums. But after April 2019, after the relationship was exposed, the payments accelerated. In the 8 months following the exposure, your campaign paid his firm over $1 million. In July 2020 alone, 77% of your entire campaign expenditure went to your husband's company. He steepled his fingers. Representative, in 20 years of constitutional litigation, I argued before judges who demanded one thing above all else: explain the pattern. The pattern here is that payments to your romantic partner's company increased after your relationship was exposed. That's not normal consulting. Under 52 U.S.C., paragraph 3114, personal use of campaign funds is a federal offense. Omar leaned aggressively toward her microphone. Those payments were for legitimate campaign services, travel, digital consulting, fundraising operations, all documented, all legal. The FEC disagreed. Johnson countered softly. Your campaign was ordered to amend its filings. That is a matter of public record. He turned a page, but I want to give you credit, Representative. After the E Street Group attracted too much attention, you dissolved the arrangement. Mr. Minette shut it down. He paused purposefully, and then he started Rose Lake Capital. Johnson transitioned to the third tab, the room falling so silent that the rustling of paper was distinctly audible. Rose Lake Capital. Your husband's venture capital management firm headquartered in Washington, D.C., he read aloud from another court document. According to documents filed in a South Dakota lawsuit, in early 2024, Rose Lake Capital had $424 in its bank account. He scribbled the number onto his pad. Your 2023 congressional financial disclosure, signed under penalty of perjury, valued your husband's combined businesses at approximately $51,000. Their bank accounts held $700, he noted, writing down $700. 1 year later, your 2024 disclosure valued Rose Lake Capital alone at between $5 and $25 million. The winery S. Crew at $1 to $5 million. He wrote the final tally and circled it, $42 to $25 million. Representative, I've practiced law for over 2 decades. I've reviewed hundreds of financial disclosures. I have never, not once, seen a growth rate of this magnitude in a legitimate business that doesn't produce a product, doesn't publicly disclose its clients, and doesn't identify its investors. Omar gripped the edge of the table. My husband is one of several partners. The valuations reflect the full enterprise value, not our personal. Then your financial disclosure is misleading, Johnson cut in, his tone gentle but firm, akin to a cross-examiner redirecting a witness, because the disclosure lists these as your household assets. You signed it under penalty of perjury. You told Business Insider in February 2025 that you were, and I'm quoting, not a millionaire. You called reports of your wealth right-wing disinformation and categorically false. He aligned the two documents side by side. So which statement is true? The disclosure that says up to $30 million or the public denial that says you're not a millionaire? Because both statements are on the record, both have your name on them, and they cannot both be accurate. Omar pivoted toward the committee chair. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to note that the scope of this hearing is federal program integrity, not my personal finances. Representative Johnson stated, the scope of this hearing is congressional financial transparency. It's in the title, and your finances are the most untransparent I've encountered in my time in Congress. Which brings me to a detail I find particularly concerning. He turned another page. The Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, froze certain funds associated with your husband's companies. For those watching at home who don't know what OFAC does, it enforces economic sanctions, it investigates terrorist financing, it traces money laundering across international borders. He stared directly at her. OFAC does not investigate California wineries, Representative. OFAC does not freeze the accounts of legitimate venture capital firms. The fact that your husband's financial activities attracted OFAC attention is not a political question. It is a national security question, and I would be failing in my constitutional duty if I didn't ask it. Omar's attorney was now whispering to her with visible urgency. Omar's hand drifted up to adjust her hijab, an involuntary movement caught by the cameras, a gesture that longtime observers recognized as her singular nervous tell. Mr. Chairman, Omar proclaimed, her volume escalating for the first time, I am being subjected to a politically motivated. Johnson raised a single index finger. It was not done aggressively, but rather in the manner a judge uses to pause an attorney. Representative, I want to acknowledge something before we continue. You are a refugee. You came to this country as a child. You survived a civil war. You built a life from nothing. That story is genuinely inspiring, and I mean that without reservation. His voice was completely devoid of sarcasm. But the Constitution doesn't have an exception clause for inspiring stories. Article 1, Section 5 gives this body the power to examine the conduct of its members, regardless of their background. Your story brought you here. Your conduct, your financial conduct, is what we're examining today. He opened the next tab. Now let's talk about your sister. The phrase hit the silent room like a dropped gavel. Omar's body language shifted immediately. Her shoulders went rigid and her eyes tightened, a physiological reaction every trial attorney recognizes as the expression of a witness hearing the exact question they prayed would remain unasked. Johnson pulled out a collection of corporate and corporation documents, publicly accessible Minnesota Secretary of State filings that had been highlighted in yellow. Your sister, Sarah Noor, founded a consulting company called Grit Partners. Her website states that she has secured more than $20 million in funding for health initiatives, CDC, USAID, the World Bank. He placed the paper down. Grit Partners was incorporated at a residential address in Lakeville, Minnesota, 17626 Hyacinth Way. He laid down a secondary document right next to it. That same address, 17626 Hyacinth Way, appears in business filings connected to individuals convicted in the Feeding Our Future fraud case. The resident of that home, Ismahan Ahmed Afra, has documented business ties to Hannah Marakeg, who pleaded guilty to $7 million in wire fraud, and to Sarah Mohammed Noor, a different person from your sister, who was sentenced to 51 months in federal prison for wire fraud and money laundering in connection with Feeding Our Future. Johnson mapped out the associations directly onto his legal pad. There were no flashy visual graphics, just handwritten names connected by arrows, mirroring how an attorney might sketch out relationships for a jury's comprehension. 17 companies were registered at addresses connected to this network. The ringleader, Amy Bach, was sentenced last May to over 41 years in federal prison. The total confirmed fraud: $250 million stolen from federal child nutrition programs, money that was supposed to feed hungry children. He looked back to Omar. Representative, I'm not accusing your sister of fraud. The public record does not establish that. What the public record establishes is that your sister chose to register her $20 million government-funded consulting business at the exact same residential address used by figures convicted in the largest pandemic fraud case in American history. And you, the most prominent elected official representing the district most affected by this fraud, have spent the last 3 years calling the investigation confusion and chaos. Omar stood up halfway. This is guilt by address. My sister's business registration has nothing. You're right, Johnson replied placidly. An address alone proves nothing. He paused for a full beat. But an address connected to 17 shell companies, 3 convicted felons, and $250 million in stolen children's food money, while your sister's company at that same address claims $20 million in government health funding, is not guilt by address, Representative. It's what prosecutors call a nexus of concern. He leaned forward slightly, marking the first break in his otherwise motionless courtroom posture. And in May of this year, when this committee attempted to subpoena records to investigate these connections, Democrats on this committee blocked the subpoena. In 20 years of litigation, Representative, I have never seen an innocent person fight to keep evidence hidden. Innocent people produce documents. They open their books. They say, look, here's everything. I have nothing to hide. You have done the opposite at every turn. Johnson paused, and when he resumed speaking, his tone was stripped of its lawyerly detachment. It became deeply personal. My father was a firefighter. He ran into a burning warehouse in 1984 to save strangers. The building exploded. His partner died in his arms. My father survived, but he was burned so badly he never worked again. He never earned more than a disability pension. He never had mysterious millions appear in accounts. He never needed OFAC to investigate his finances. He stared at Omar, and for the first time, true emotion was visible behind his eyes. It was not rage, but a profound, quiet disappointment, the sorrow of a man whose father had sacrificed everything, watching others exploit the system for personal gain. My father would have been ashamed, genuinely, deeply ashamed, if anyone in his family was connected to an address where people stole money meant to feed children. Not because of the politics, but because children needed those meals and someone took them. Johnson moved to the subsequent tab in his file. The atmosphere in the room was still reeling from the previous exchange. Observers in the gallery were leaning forward in their seats, smartphones were recording, and the live viewership counter on the C-SPAN feed was skyrocketing. Representative Omar, on the 27th of January, 2024, you delivered a speech at the Hyatt Regency Hotel in downtown Minneapolis. The speech was in Somali. You were addressing Somali American constituents regarding the Ethiopia-Somaliland port deal. Omar's eyes grew cold. She was highly familiar with this specific controversy. There have been disputes about the translation of that speech. Your office has called certain translations inaccurate. I'm not going to litigate which translation is correct. I'm going to do something simpler, Johnson said. He produced a printed copy of Omar's self-approved translation, the exact version her team had distributed to the press. This is the translation your office endorsed. Your version. Your words as you want them understood. He read aloud. As long as I am in the United States Congress, Somalia will never be alone in its fight. We are an organized society. We know our blood, our heritage, our obligations to each other. He set the document down. I'm not going to read the contested version. I don't need to, because even in your translation, Representative, you stood before an audience of Somali nationals and told them that you would use your position in the United States Congress to protect Somalia's territorial interests in a geopolitical dispute with Ethiopia. He reached into his breast pocket and extracted his weathered, dog-eared copy of the Constitution. Let me read you 2 oaths. He flipped to a page marked with a fold. The oath of allegiance taken by every naturalized citizen. I hereby declare on oath that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure all allegiance and fidelity to any foreign prince, potentate, state, or sovereignty. He then turned to another marked page. The congressional oath. I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same Somalia. He snapped the book shut. You swore to renounce allegiance to foreign states. Then you promised a foreign audience you would protect a foreign nation's interests from inside our government. Those two statements are in direct constitutional conflict. Omar lost her composure. She sprang to her feet, placing one hand flat against the table and aiming the other squarely at Johnson. This hearing is a sham. You are a Christian nationalist conducting an inquisition. This is what theocracy looks like in America. You sit there with your pocket constitution while you persecute a Muslim woman for caring about the country she was born in. Johnson waited patiently. He did not raise his hand to silence her, nor did he strike the gavel. He permitted her to vent until she naturally ran out of steam, a process that consumed almost an entire minute. As the echoes of her shouting dissipated, the room fell so completely silent that the hum of the HVAC system became the only sound. He finally spoke, his voice remaining quiet, and without rising from his seat. Representative, you just called me a Christian nationalist. I am a Christian. I've never hidden that. And I'm a constitutionalist. I've never hidden that either. He intertwined his fingers. But a Christian nationalist conducting an inquisition? An inquisition doesn't give you 15 minutes to attack the inquisitor before he asks a single question. An inquisition doesn't provide you legal counsel. An inquisition doesn't broadcast on C-SPAN for 330 million Americans to watch in real time. He lifted the pocket constitution into view. What I am conducting is a hearing under Article 1 with rules, with evidence, with documents you signed, with your own translations of your own speeches. The fact that you don't recognize due process when you're on the receiving end of it, Representative, that is the most troubling thing you've said today. Johnson stood up from his chair. It was his first time standing during the entire proceedings, and the physical shift drastically altered the dynamics of the room. He appeared tall, calm, and highly deliberate. A man who had spent 20 years delivering closing arguments and knew perfectly well that juries only truly recall the final 5 minutes of a trial. Representative Omar, I've asked you about 5 subjects today: your campaign payments to your boyfriend's company, your household's unexplained financial explosion, your sister's connection to the address of convicted federal fraudsters, your promise to protect a foreign nation from inside our government, and your response to every question, which has been to call the process racist, the speaker a nationalist, and the investigation a sham. He briefly looked toward the cameras before returning his gaze to Omar. I want to close with a constitutional observation, not a political one, a legal one. He held up the pocket constitution once more. The framers understood something about human nature that we sometimes forget. They understood that power corrupts, that people who enter public service with good intentions can be seduced by the opportunity to enrich themselves. That oaths sworn before God and country can be broken when the price is right. That is why they wrote Article 1, Section 5, not as a weapon, but as a safeguard. The power to discipline members of this body exists because the framers knew in 1787 that someday a member of Congress would need to answer questions they didn't want to answer. He began ticking off items on his fingers. You swore to serve your constituents. The evidence suggests you served your family's finances. $3 million to your boyfriend's company, an unexplained $30 million fortune, a husband whose accounts attracted the attention of an agency that investigates terrorist financing. You swore to uphold the law. The FEC ordered your filings amended. Your tax filing history includes documented irregularities. Your financial disclosures contradict your public statements. You swore to renounce allegiance to foreign states. You told a Somali audience in your own approved translation that you would protect Somalia's interests from inside the United States Congress. And you swore to defend the Constitution. Today, when that Constitution was used to ask you questions, you called it an inquisition. He laid the Constitution down upon the dais. Representative, I have here a formal referral to the House Ethics Committee. He placed the official document right next to the little booklet. It is signed by members of both parties. It requests a full investigation into your financial disclosures, your campaign finance history, your family's connections to the Feeding Our Future fraud network, and your oath compliance. Omar's attorney was whispering at a frantic pace, but Omar was completely unresponsive to him. Her gaze was locked on the document. This is not a political action, Representative. This is a constitutional process, the same process that has applied to every member of this body for 237 years. He looked at her for the very last time. You've had 8 years to release your immigration records. You've had 3 years to explain your finances. You've had 3 months to comply with the committee's document requests. At every turn, you've chosen silence, deflection, or accusation. Today, the Constitution asks its questions. And unlike a press conference, unlike a tweet, unlike a cable news segment, the Constitution requires answers. Johnson returned to his seat, squared the edges of his folder, and set his pen neatly on top. I have no further questions, Mr. Chairman. The room was utterly breathless. Omar remained completely frozen. Her pre-written closing statement, a 12-page document that her staff had spent an entire week composing, rested ignored in front of her. She stared at it, briefly picked it up, silently read the opening sentence and set it back down. Her lawyer leaned closer one final time, but Omar merely gave a tiny, rigid shake of her head. She pushed her chair away from the table and stood up. She gathered absolutely none of her belongings, abandoning her notes, her water bottle, and her cell phone on the desk. Her aides frantically scrambled to collect the items she had forsaken. She proceeded toward the exit without asking for a recess, without issuing a final statement, without glaring at the cameras, and without making eye contact with Johnson. She walked in the manner of someone departing a courtroom following a guilty verdict, moving mechanically, eyes locked forward, attempting to process an event too monumental to fully comprehend in the immediate aftermath. No one attempted to stop her. No one yelled out a question. The journalists in the gallery were far too shell-shocked to call out to her. They had witnessed Omar battle her way through seemingly everything: Trump rallies, committee expulsions, censure votes, yet they had never seen her exit a room in total silence. Chairman Comer glanced at the vacant witness chair, then looked toward Johnson. Johnson met his gaze and gave a single nod. Comer struck the gavel. The committee will stand in recess. Johnson shut his folder, slipped the pocket Constitution back into his suit jacket, and began sorting his notes with the calm, unhurried precision of a man who had successfully concluded a case he had spent his entire life preparing. The video footage circulated more rapidly than anyone could have anticipated. The clip featuring the phrase, "I have your sister's address," amassed 60 million views within a mere 36 hours. Legal commentators across every news network, even those who clearly resented doing so, characterized the event as the most disciplined congressional cross-examination in modern history. CNN's Jake Tapper, during a broadcast that visibly caused him unease, pointed out that Johnson had leaned entirely on public records, FEC filings, and Omar's self-sanctioned translations. There was simply nothing to fact-check, as Johnson had provided all his citations live in real time. Comparisons to other politicians were drawn instantly and proved highly illuminating. Kennedy had famously demolished opponents using relatable stories. Vance dismantled adversaries via personalized counterattacks. Johnson, however, annihilated his target, using nothing but the law itself, statutes, constitutional clauses, and documented proof. He employed no metaphors, no parables, and no folksy anecdotes about animals. It was purely a 20-year litigator executing a flawless closing argument on national television. The phrase constitutional KO trended online for 5 consecutive days. The term sister's address evolved into cultural shorthand for any scandal where familial proximity to criminal fraud was too exact to be brushed off as a coincidence. The oath, standing as the simplest hashtag of all, emerged as the most potent, heavily shared by military veterans, naturalized American citizens, and law professors who immediately adopted Johnson's dual oath recital as an educational tool. Omar's official reaction adhered to the playbook her team had perfected over 7 years of crisis management. She released a written statement condemning the hearing as a synchronized attack upon a black Muslim refugee. and she vowed to keep fighting on behalf of Minnesota families. However, this statement completely ignored the E Street Group money transfers. It offered no explanation for the explosive growth of Rose Lake Capital. It failed to clarify the Hyacinth Way residential address. It completely ignored the constitutional critique of her Somalia speech. It addressed absolutely nothing, explained absolutely nothing, and answered absolutely nothing. But this time, that glaring absence of answers was impossible to ignore. The resulting political fallout surpassed worst-case models drawn up by Omar's allies. Within a span of 10 days, her approval rating in her home district plummeted by 11 points, the sharpest drop of her entire political career. Among voters over the age of 50, that plunge reached 19 points. 3 moderate House Democrats, all representing highly competitive swing districts, released a unified public statement demanding that Omar cooperate fully and transparently with all ongoing probes. When questioned at a press conference, Nancy Pelosi delivered a remark that experienced political insiders immediately recognized as a political death sentence elegantly disguised in diplomatic silk. All members of Congress should be prepared to explain their public service and their financial disclosures. That's not partisan. That's accountability. The reaction from the squad was striking primarily for its tepid nature. Rashida Tlaib labeled the proceedings Islamophobic theater. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted a solitary sentence of support, standing with my colleague Ilhan Omar, yet tellingly omitted any mention of the finances, the sister, the address, or the constitutional analysis. Ayanna Pressley put out a generic statement regarding attacks directed at women of color. The shows of solidarity felt obligatory. The genuine enthusiasm had vanished. Meanwhile, the gears of institutional oversight began grinding at an accelerated pace. The House Ethics Committee officially launched an inquiry into Omar's financial disclosure forms referencing Johnson's referral. The Department of Justice's probe into her immigration past, which had been quietly simmering for years, suddenly gained what an internal DOJ source labeled renewed emphasis at the leadership level. The House Oversight Committee reissued its subpoena for Tim Mynette's Rose Lake Capital records. On this vote, 4 Democrats who had previously blocked the measure opted to switch their positions, allowing the subpoena to pass. OFAC broadened the scope of its review. The FEC reignited its investigation into the E Street Group's payment patterns. The Minnesota Legislative Committee assigned to investigate the Feeding Our Future debacle issued a formal demand for the financial records of Sarah Noor's Grit partners. Finally, Omar's public speaking engagements, which previously fetched between $15,000 and $20,000 per appearance, suffered 3 outright cancellations in just 1 week. A prominent progressive PAC reorganized its autumn fundraising event to spotlight an entirely different headliner, and 2 universities indefinitely delayed her scheduled campus appearances.